Hey everyone, like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so we can uncover today's jaw-dropping story together. No one expects a nightmare to begin with a child's whisper, but in this case, the truth didn't come from police, neighbors, or teachers. It came from a mother standing in her own home, realizing that something was terribly wrong with her 12-year-old son. This is the case of Cristian Fernandez, a story that shocked an entire community, not just because of what happened, but because of who was involved. A story that forces uncomfortable questions about childhood, responsibility, trauma, and where blame truly belongs. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Cristian was just a kid, quiet, small for his age. He lived with his mother in Florida in a home that, from the outside, looked ordinary. No crime tape, no police lights, no warning signs that something unthinkable was unfolding behind closed doors. Then one day, Cristian's mother made a discovery that would change everything. Inside their home, she found her infant daughter, Cristian's baby sister, unresponsive. Panic set in immediately. Emergency services were called. Paramedics arrived. But it was already too late. The baby was gone. What followed was confusion, fear, and disbelief. At first, there were no obvious answers. Accidents happen. Babies can fall. Parents live with that fear every day, but something about the situation didn't sit right with investigators. And slowly, quietly, attention turned toward the only other person who had been with the baby. Cristian. He was just 12 years old. When police began asking questions, they weren't looking at him as a suspect at first. They were trying to understand what happened. But as the conversation continued, the story began to shift. Cristian's answers didn't line up. Details changed. Small things didn't make sense. And then came the moment that would define this case. Cristian admitted what he had done. The words were simple, calm, almost detached. There was no dramatic breakdown, no emotional explosion, just a confession that stunned everyone who heard it. A 12-year-old boy had killed his baby sister. News of the case spread fast, and public reaction was immediate and intense. People didn't just ask what happened, they asked how. How could a child do something like this? And maybe even more disturbing, how did it get to this point without anyone noticing? Because when investigators looked deeper, they realized this story didn't begin with the baby's death. It began years earlier. Cristian's childhood, according to court records and testimony, was filled with instability. His early life was marked by neglect, exposure to violence, and long periods without proper care. He had been left alone for hours at a time when he was much younger. There were reports of emotional and physical abuse. Adults who were supposed to protect him had failed. Again and again. By the time Cristian was 12, he wasn't living like a typical child. He carried responsibilities far beyond his age. He was often expected to help care for his infant sister. He spent long stretches unsupervised, and according to experts later involved in the case, he showed signs of emotional damage that had never been treated. Still, none of that made the crime easier to understand. Prosecutors faced a difficult decision. Cristian was a child, but the act was severe. They chose to charge him with first-degree murder, an adult-level charge that shocked many legal experts and child advocates. It was rare, almost unheard of. Suddenly, Cristian Fernandez wasn't just a child in trouble. He was a symbol in a much larger debate. Was he a killer who deserved adult punishment, or a broken child who had been shaped by years of neglect? The courtroom became the center of that debate. Prosecutors argued that Cristian knew exactly what he was doing. They pointed to his confession, his understanding of right and wrong, and the seriousness of the act. They told the jury this wasn't an accident. It was intentional. The defense painted a very different picture. They described a boy who had never been given a chance to be a child. A boy raised in chaos. A boy whose brain was still developing, whose emotional world was shaped by fear and abandonment. They argued that Cristian didn't fully understand the consequences of his actions in the way an adult would. Experts testified about childhood trauma. about how long-term neglect can damage judgment and impulse control, about how children exposed to violence often repeat it, not because they are evil, but because it's all they know. Outside the courtroom, public opinion was divided. Some people were angry. They believed justice meant punishment, no matter the age. Others were deeply uncomfortable with the idea of sending a 12-year-old to prison for life. They saw Cristian not just as an offender, but as a victim of a system that failed him long before the crime. Media coverage added fuel to the fire. Headlines focused on the horror of the act, often leaving out the years of neglect that came before it. Cristian's face became known nationwide, and with that attention came judgment, much of it harsh and much of it permanent. But behind all the arguments, one fact remained painfully clear. A baby had lost her life, a family was destroyed, and a child's future was hanging in the balance. As the case moved forward, it became about more than Cristian Fernandez. It became about how society handles children who commit serious crimes, about whether punishment can replace prevention, about how many warning signs were missed before it was too late. Because Cristian didn't suddenly become dangerous at 12. He was shaped, slowly, quietly, over years. And that raises the hardest question of all, one that still doesn't have an easy answer. When a child commits an unthinkable act, where does responsibility truly lie? In the next part of this story, we'll go deeper into Cristian's early life, what investigators uncovered about his upbringing, the red flags that were ignored, and how a damaged childhood laid the groundwork for a tragedy no one saw coming. Because to understand the crime, you first have to understand the child. Before investigators could understand how a 12-year-old could commit such a horrifying act, they had to look backward, far backward, because Cristian Fernandez's story didn't begin with the death of his baby sister. It began with a childhood shaped by chaos, neglect, and silence. Cristian was born into instability. From an early age, his life lacked structure and safety. Court records later showed that he spent long hours alone when he was far too young to care for himself. There were reports that he wandered outside unsupervised, knocked on neighbors' doors looking for food, and missed basic care that most children take for granted. These weren't rumors. They were documented concerns that never fully turned into protection. Adults saw pieces of the problem, but no one saw the whole picture. His mother struggled. She was young, overwhelmed, and dealing with her own issues. The home environment was not calm or predictable. Arguments were common. Stress was constant. Cristian grew up learning that survival meant adapting quickly and staying quiet. And when a child grows up without safety, the brain learns different rules. Experts later explained that children like Cristian often develop emotional gaps. They don't process fear or empathy the same way. They struggle with impulse control. They don't learn healthy ways to deal with anger or frustration because no one ever teaches them. Instead, they absorb what they see. According to testimony, Cristian was exposed to violence at a young age. He witnessed adults yelling, threatening, and sometimes hurting each other. For a developing child, this becomes normal. Violence stops feeling shocking. It becomes a tool. By the time Cristian was old enough to understand right and wrong, those lines were already blurred. Teachers noticed things too. School records showed behavioral problems. Cristian struggled to focus. He had trouble connecting with other kids. Sometimes he acted out. Other times he withdrew completely. These are classic warning signs, but they are also common, which makes them easy to overlook. No one connected the dots. There were moments when intervention could have changed everything. Child services had been involved in the family's life at different points. Reports were made, concerns were noted, but like many overburdened systems, follow-through was limited. The situation never reached the level where Cristian was removed permanently or given long-term help, so the cycle continued. Then came the birth of his baby sister. Suddenly, Cristian's life changed again, but not in the way a child should. Instead of being protected from responsibility, he was given more of it. According to court documents, he was often expected to help care for the baby, sometimes for long periods, sometimes alone. For a 12-year-old with emotional damage and poor impulse control, this was dangerous. Experts later testified that placing a child with known behavioral issues in charge of an infant without supervision is a serious risk. Not because the child is evil, but because they are not equipped to handle stress, frustration, or fear in healthy ways. And stress was everywhere. The home was crowded, tension was high, sleep was disrupted, babies cry. And crying is one of the biggest triggers for abuse, especially in unstable homes. Adults understand that crying is normal. Children often don't. On the day of the baby's death, investigators believe Cristian was alone with her. What happened in those moments is known mostly through his own words. His confession described frustration, anger, a loss of control. It was not a story of planning. It was a story of impulse. But the law doesn't measure impulse the same way psychology does. When Cristian confessed, many people expected tears, panic, or fear. Instead, his tone was flat, calm, almost distant. That reaction disturbed investigators, but experts later explained it. Children with long-term trauma often disconnect from emotion. It's a defense mechanism. Feeling nothing feels safer than feeling everything. This emotional flatness would later become a major point in court. Prosecutors saw it as proof of awareness. The defense saw it as proof of damage. As news of Cristian's background became public, reactions shifted. Some people began asking why no one stepped in earlier, why reports didn't lead to real help, why a child with so many warning signs was left to navigate life alone. But others pushed back hard. They argued that a difficult childhood doesn't excuse murder, that plenty of abused children never hurt anyone, that sympathy should not replace justice. Both sides were right, and that's what made this case so complicated, because Cristian was not just a victim, he was also responsible for a death, and the system had to decide which mattered more. As prosecutors prepared their case, they faced a rare challenge. Charging a 12-year-old with first-degree murder meant convincing a jury that a child had adult-level intent, that he understood consequences the same way an adult would. That punishment, not rehabilitation, was the answer. The defense prepared to fight that idea with everything they had. They gathered psychologists, child development experts, and trauma specialists. They built a picture of Cristian not as a monster, but as a product of neglect. A child whose emotional growth was stunted. A child who was never taught how to manage anger or fear. They argued that Cristian's brain was still developing, that science shows children do not fully understand long-term consequences, that sending him into the adult justice system would not protect society, it would destroy any chance he had to change. Outside the courtroom, the debate grew louder. Some saw Cristian as a warning about violent youth. Others saw him as a warning about failed systems. News outlets often focused on the most shocking detail, a 12-year-old killer, because it grabbed attention. But those who looked deeper saw something else. They saw years of neglect hiding in plain sight. Cristian didn't fall through the cracks in one moment. He slipped slowly, while everyone assumed someone else was watching. And by the time the system finally paid attention, it was because a life had already been lost. In the next part of this story, we'll move into the investigation itself, how police questioned a child suspect, how the confession was handled, and why that interrogation became one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. Because when the suspect is a child, every word matters, and every mistake carries lifelong consequences. When police realized they were dealing with more than a tragic accident, the tone of the investigation shifted quietly but dramatically. Cristian Fernandez was no longer just a grieving brother. He was now the only witness, and possibly the only suspect, in the death of his baby sister, and he was only 12. From the start, investigators faced a delicate situation. Questioning a child is not the same as questioning an adult. Children want to please authority figures. They are easily influenced. They don't always understand their rights. One wrong approach can shape everything that follows. Cristian was brought in for questioning. He sat in a small room, his feet barely touching the floor. No lawyer, no trained child advocate present at first. His mother had given permission for questioning, but she was not in the room for much of it. That detail would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the case. At first, the questions were simple. What happened? Where were you? What did the baby do? Cristian answered quietly. His voice didn't shake. He didn't cry. That calmness unsettled investigators, and later, the public. But psychologists would later explain that children who grow up in unstable homes often learn to shut down emotionally. It's how they survive. As the questioning continued, inconsistencies appeared. Cristian's story shifted slightly. Timelines changed, details blurred. To detectives, this raised suspicion. But child experts would later argue that inconsistency is common in children under stress, especially when fear and guilt are involved. Then came the confession. Cristian admitted that he had hurt his baby sister. He described becoming frustrated when she cried. He talked about losing control. His words were simple, not graphic. There was no boasting, no attempt to blame someone else, just a statement of what he said happened. Investigators recorded the confession, and almost immediately, legal questions began to surface. Did Cristian truly understand what he was admitting to? Did he understand the consequences of those words? And was the interrogation conducted in a way that protected his rights? The defense would later argue that it was not. They claimed Cristian was too young to grasp the legal meaning of his confession, that he did not fully understand that he was confessing to a crime that could put him in prison for life. They argued that the absence of a lawyer or child advocate made the confession unreliable. Prosecutors disagreed. They argued that Cristian knew right from wrong, that he understood death, that his confession was voluntary and detailed enough to be credible. They pointed to his calm demeanor as evidence of awareness and control. This difference in interpretation became central to the case, because if the confession was ruled invalid, the prosecution's case weakened significantly. There was little physical evidence linking Cristian directly to the fatal act beyond his own words. The court had to decide, was this a child speaking honestly, or a child being led? Psychologists were brought in to analyze the interrogation. Some testified that the questioning was not aggressive, that no threats or promises were made. Others pointed out subtler issues, leading questions, repeated phrasing, and the power imbalance between a child and adult authority figures. They explained that children often tell adults what they think adults want to hear, especially children who have learned that obedience equals safety. The confession was ultimately allowed into evidence, but not without controversy. Public reaction was intense. Many people watched clips of the interrogation and felt uncomfortable. They saw a small boy, alone in a room, trying to answer questions he didn't fully understand. Others saw something else entirely, a calm child admitting to a violent act without remorse. Once again, the case split public opinion. Was Cristian emotionally detached because he was dangerous, or because he was damaged? As the investigation continued, police examined Cristian's past behavior. They looked for signs of violence. There were incidents, aggression toward other children, problems at school, but nothing that clearly predicted what happened. That's what made the case so unsettling. There was no long record of cruelty, no pattern of deliberate harm, just a troubled child in a chaotic environment. Prosecutors still believed they had enough. They filed the charges. Cristian Fernandez was formally charged with first-degree murder, becoming one of the youngest people in the country to face such a charge. The decision sent shockwaves through legal circles. Child advocacy groups spoke out. Legal scholars debated whether the justice system was equipped to handle a case like this. The stakes were enormous. If convicted as charged, Cristian could face life in prison, not a juvenile facility, an adult prison. a sentence longer than his entire life. As the case moved toward trial, both sides understood the weight of what was coming. This wasn't just about one boy, it was about setting a precedent, about how society defines responsibility, about whether childhood trauma is mitigation or irrelevant. Cristian sat in detention while lawyers argued his future. He was still growing, still learning, still a child. But the system was preparing to judge him as something else entirely. In the next part of this story, we'll step inside the courtroom, where science, emotion, and law collide, and where a jury is asked to decide whether a child can truly be a murderer in the eyes of the law, because once the trial begins, there is no turning back. By the time Cristian Fernandez walked into the courtroom, the case had already become much bigger than him. This was no longer just about what happened to a baby girl. It was about how the justice system treats children when they commit acts that adults struggle to understand. The courtroom was tense from the very first day. On one side sat prosecutors, firm in their belief that a crime had been committed and that accountability mattered, no matter the age. On the other side sat defense attorneys, determined to show that this was not a case of evil, but a case of failure, neglect, and a child who never stood a real chance. Cristian sat quietly beside his lawyers. He looked small in his chair, younger than 12. His feet still didn't reach the floor. To some jurors, that image alone was disturbing. To others, it didn't erase what he was accused of doing. The prosecution went first. They laid out a clear, simple argument. A baby was dead. Cristian was alone with her. He confessed. In their view, those facts were enough. They argued that Cristian knew his actions were wrong, that he understood death, and that he tried to cover up what happened afterward. They reminded the jury that children are taught right from wrong early, that age does not automatically erase responsibility. They warned against letting sympathy cloud judgment. This was not an accident, they argued. This was a violent act. But the defense came back just as strong. They didn't deny that the baby died while in Cristian's care. They didn't deny that Cristian said he hurt her. Instead, they asked the jury to look deeper, far deeper than the moment of death. They talked about Cristian's childhood. They described years of neglect, instability, and emotional damage. They explained how he was left alone for long periods, how he lacked supervision, how no one taught him how to handle frustration or stress. They reminded the jury that Cristian was not raised in a safe or healthy environment. He was raised in survival mode. Then the experts took the stand. Child psychologists explained how a 12-year-old's brain works. They talked about impulse control, or the lack of it. They explained that children do not process consequences the way adults do, that when emotions spike, reasoning shuts down. They used simple examples. A child knows stealing is wrong, but still steals candy. A child knows hitting is wrong, but hits when angry. Now imagine that child caring for a crying infant without help. The defense argued that Cristian's actions were the result of a moment of overwhelming stress, not intent to kill. They also focused heavily on the interrogation. Experts questioned whether Cristian truly understood his rights, whether he grasped what it meant to confess. They argued that his calm tone did not mean guilt. It meant emotional shutdown. The prosecution challenged that idea. They brought their own experts, who testified that Cristian's statements showed awareness, that he used language indicating understanding, that he did not appear confused or coerced. The courtroom became a battleground of science. One expert said the brain was too immature. Another said maturity varies by child. One said trauma reduces judgment. Another said trauma does not erase responsibility. The jury watched, listened, took notes. But the most emotional moments came from the family testimony. Cristian's mother took the stand. Her voice broke as she spoke about her children, about how overwhelmed she felt, about how she never imagined something like this could happen. Some jurors saw pain. Others saw neglect. The prosecution questioned her choices, leaving a troubled child alone with an infant. The defense reminded everyone that poverty, stress, and lack of support play a role in parenting decisions. No one left that testimony untouched. As days passed, the weight of the decision became clearer. If the jury convicted Cristian of first-degree murder, they would be saying that a child could carry adult guilt. If they acquitted or reduced the charge, they would be saying that age and trauma matter more than outcome. There was no easy answer. Outside the courtroom, protests formed. Child advocates demanded reform. Others demanded justice for the baby. Social media was divided, angry, emotional. Inside, the jury prepared to decide. Closing arguments brought everything to a head. The prosecution spoke about the baby's life. Short, helpless, ended violently. They asked the jury to remember that justice exists to protect the most vulnerable. The defense spoke about Cristian's life, shaped by neglect, damaged before it truly began. They asked the jury to consider whether punishment would solve anything. They ended with a simple question. What does justice look like for a child? Then the jury was sent to deliberate. Hours passed, then days. Cristian waited in a holding room, coloring pictures, reading books meant for children younger than him. The contrast was painful. Finally, the jury returned. The verdict was not what many expected. Cristian was not convicted of first-degree murder. Instead, the jury found him guilty of a lesser charge, manslaughter. The decision acknowledged responsibility, but not intent. Relief swept through some parts of the courtroom. Others felt anger. No one felt satisfied. Cristian was spared a life sentence, but he was not free. The question now became punishment. Should a child go to prison? Should he be placed in a juvenile facility? Should rehabilitation be the focus or deterrence? In the next part of this story, we'll explore the sentencing phase, where the court decides how long a child should pay for a moment that changed multiple lives forever. Because sometimes the verdict is only the beginning. The sentencing phase of Cristian Fernandez's case was where emotion truly overtook legal language. The verdict had already drawn a line between intent and responsibility, but now the court faced an even harder question. What should happen to a child who caused a death but never fully lived a childhood himself? The courtroom felt different during sentencing. The sharp edge of argument was replaced by something heavier, quieter. Everyone understood that whatever decision was made would shape Cristian's entire future. There were no takebacks here. No appeals that could erase the years ahead. Prosecutors asked the court to send a strong message. They argued that even though the jury rejected first-degree murder, the loss of life still demanded serious consequences. They warned that leniency could suggest that children are immune from accountability. They spoke about deterrence, about protecting other vulnerable children. They recommended a long sentence, one that would extend well into Cristian's adulthood. The defense responded with urgency. They reminded the judge that Cristian was 12 years old at the time of the incident. 12 when he was interrogated. 12 when his life became defined by a single moment. They argued that locking him away for decades would not honor the life lost. It would simply create another one ruined. They talked about rehabilitation. They presented evidence showing that Cristian responded well to structure when given proper support, that he showed improvement in controlled environments. That therapy helped him process emotions he had never been taught to handle. They argued that children change, that the brain continues developing well into the 20s, that the justice system should focus on who Cristian could become, not just who he was at his worst moment. Then came the statements. Family members of the baby spoke about their loss, about birthdays that would never come, about silence where laughter should have been. Their pain was raw, and no one questioned its validity. Cristian's side spoke too. Teachers, counselors, mental health professionals. They described a boy who struggled but tried, a child who followed rules when expectations were clear, a child who had never been given stability before being judged for failing without it. Cristian himself addressed the court. His voice was quiet, He didn't use big words. He didn't make excuses. He said he was sorry. He said he wished he could take it back. He said he didn't understand what he was doing at the time. Some believed him, some didn't. The judge listened carefully. When the sentence was finally announced, it reflected the impossible balance the court was trying to strike. Cristian was sentenced to a term that allowed for rehabilitation, but still acknowledged the seriousness of the crime. He would serve time in a juvenile facility, with the possibility of extended supervision depending on his progress. He would not be sent to adult prison, at least not immediately. The sentence was met with mixed reactions. Some felt justice had been served, others felt it was too harsh. Many felt it was too light, but nearly everyone agreed on one thing. This case exposed deep cracks in the system. Cristian was taken into custody and placed in a juvenile detention center. Life there was structured. Strict schedules, therapy sessions, school classes, counseling. For the first time, his days had predictability, and strangely, that stability helped him. Reports from the facility showed improvement. He followed rules. He participated in therapy. He began to understand concepts like responsibility, empathy, and emotional regulation, things that were never consistently taught to him before. This didn't mean everything was easy. He struggled with guilt, with anger, with confusion. He had nightmares. He asked questions that didn't have answers. Why didn't someone help sooner? Why did it take a tragedy for people to care? Meanwhile, outside the facility, the case continued to influence conversations nationwide. Lawmakers debated age limits for prosecution. Child advocacy groups pushed for reform in how at-risk families are monitored. Mental health professionals called for better early intervention. Cristian's name became part of larger discussions about juvenile justice. Some argued that the system worked, that it held him accountable while offering a chance to change. Others argued that the system failed long before the crime ever happened, that by the time Cristian reached the courtroom, every safety net had already broken. As years passed, Cristian grew older. He moved through different stages of the juvenile system. His case was reviewed periodically. Each review looked at his behavior, his mental health, his progress. The question always lingered. Was he still a danger? Evaluations suggested growth, not perfection, not a miracle, but growth. He showed remorse. He understood the seriousness of what happened. He expressed a desire to live differently. These are things the system hopes to see, but rarely guarantees. Still, there were no easy answers. Some people will always see Cristian as a child who killed. Others will always see him as a child who was failed. Both views exist at the same time, and neither completely erases the other. This case never allowed for simple conclusions. It forced people to sit with discomfort, with the idea that accountability and compassion can exist together, with the truth that preventing tragedy often requires action long before courts get involved. In the next part of this story, we'll look at the long-term impact of the case, how it changed laws, influenced public opinion, and followed Cristian as he grew older. Because true crime doesn't end with sentencing. Sometimes the real story begins afterward. By the time Cristian Fernandez had been in the juvenile system for a few years, the case was no longer front-page news, but its impact hadn't faded. It had simply moved into quieter spaces, courtrooms, policy meetings, classrooms, and the private thoughts of people who followed the case closely. Inside the system, Cristian was changing. That doesn't mean everything suddenly became normal or easy. Growth inside juvenile detention is slow and uneven. Some days were productive, others were heavy. Cristian continued therapy, where professionals worked with him on emotional awareness, impulse control, and understanding harm. These were lessons most children learn gradually at home. Cristian was learning them late, under supervision. Evaluations showed progress, but they also showed scars. Doctors noted signs of long-term trauma, emotional delay, difficulty forming trust. These weren't excuses. They were explanations. They helped the court understand what kind of support Cristian needed, not just what rules he had broken. For the first time, he had consistency. Meals came at the same time every day. School followed a routine. Consequences were clear and predictable. That structure helped him stabilize. It also raised an uncomfortable question many experts pointed out later. If this level of care had existed earlier, would the tragedy have happened at all? Meanwhile, the legal system kept watching. Cristian's sentence allowed for review as he aged. With each review came debates. Should he be released? Should he remain under supervision? Was rehabilitation enough, or was public safety still at risk? These weren't abstract questions. They carried real consequences. Some officials argued that Cristian showed genuine change. They pointed to his behavior records, therapy progress, and evaluations. They said continued detention could do more harm than good. Others remained cautious. They reminded everyone that a life had been lost, that remorse doesn't erase outcome, that predicting future behavior is never certain. Outside the system, the case continued to shape conversations. Child advocacy groups used Cristian's story to argue for earlier intervention in high-risk families. They pushed for better training for teachers, social workers, and law enforcement. They emphasized that warning signs often appear long before violence does, but only if someone is watching closely. Legal scholars debated the age of criminal responsibility. Some cited Cristian's case as proof that charging children as adults, or close to it, creates more harm than safety. Others argued that the justice system must retain the ability to respond firmly even when the offender is young. Public opinion remained divided. Some people believed Cristian deserved a second chance. Others believed that some actions permanently change how society should respond to someone. Time didn't soften those opinions, it only made them quieter. As Cristian approached his teenage years and then his later teens, he became more aware of the world outside the facility. He learned how widely his case had been discussed, how strangers had opinions about his life, how his name had become a symbol. That awareness was difficult. Therapists reported that he struggled with identity. Was he a monster, a mistake, a child who failed, or a child who was failed? Those questions don't have clean answers, especially for someone still developing. One thing was clear: he could never escape what happened. Even if released, his past would follow him. Background checks, media records, online discussions that never disappear. Rehabilitation doesn't erase history. It teaches someone how to live with it. As his case reviews continued, the system leaned toward caution with hope. Cristian remained under supervision. Conditions were strict. Support was ongoing. The goal wasn't freedom. It was stability without confinement. For many experts, this was the most responsible path forward, not because Cristian was forgiven, but because he had changed, and because society had a responsibility not just to punish, but to prevent future harm. The tragedy at the center of this case could never be undone. A baby lost her life. A family was shattered. A child became responsible for something no child should ever carry. But the case also forced a difficult truth into the open. Punishment alone cannot fix what neglect creates. By the time the law steps in, the damage is often already done. Cristian Fernandez's story is not comfortable. It doesn't fit neatly into categories of good and evil. It lives in the gray space where trauma, responsibility, and consequence collide. In the next part of this story, we'll examine how the public narrative around Cristian evolved over time, and how media coverage shaped the way people understood the case. Because in true crime, the story we tell often matters as much as the truth itself. By the time years had passed since the original trial, the story of Cristian Fernandez had taken on a life of its own. It was no longer just a court case, it had become a symbol. And like most symbols, it was shaped less by facts over time and more by the way people talked about it. Media played a powerful role. Early coverage focused almost entirely on shock value. Headlines emphasized the age, 12-year-old charged with murder. That framing alone set the tone. Many people never read beyond the headline. They didn't learn about the neglect, the warnings, the missed chances to intervene. What stuck was the idea of a child capable of something unthinkable. That image was hard to undo. As documentaries, podcasts, and articles revisited the case, some tried to add nuance. They explored Cristian's background, the failures of child services, and the science of child development. But those stories reached a smaller audience. Fear spreads faster than context. Online discussions were especially harsh. Comment sections became battlegrounds. Some demanded lifelong punishment. Others defended Cristian fiercely. Very few acknowledged both sides at once. The internet prefers clear villains and clear victims. This case refused to provide that. Over time, Cristian himself became almost invisible in the conversation. People argued about him without considering that he was still alive, still growing, still affected by every word written about him. He was discussed as an idea, not a person. This is one of the quiet consequences of true crime fame. For victims' families, the attention can reopen wounds. For offenders, especially juvenile ones, it can freeze them in their worst moment forever. Mental health experts warned about this effect. They explained that constant public judgment can slow rehabilitation. That shame without guidance leads to withdrawal, not growth. That children labeled as monsters often stop believing they can be anything else. Inside the system, professionals worked to counter that. They focused on accountability without dehumanization, on helping Cristian understand responsibility while still believing he had a future. It was a difficult balance, especially knowing that public opinion could shift at any moment. As Cristian matured, evaluations showed increased emotional awareness. He could talk about the harm he caused without shutting down. He could express remorse more clearly. He understood the concept of permanence, that some consequences never fade, no matter how much change occurs. This didn't mean forgiveness was expected. It meant understanding was possible. The case also began appearing in academic settings. Law schools discussed it in criminal justice courses. Psychology programs used it as an example of trauma's impact on development. Social work students studied it as a failure of early intervention systems. In that sense, the tragedy became a lesson, not just about crime, but about prevention. Experts pointed out that Cristian's behavior didn't come out of nowhere. There were signs, missed appointments, reports that went nowhere, teachers who noticed something was wrong but lacked resources to act. The system didn't fail in one dramatic way. It failed quietly, repeatedly. This realization changed how some agencies approached similar cases. Risk assessments became more detailed, follow-ups more frequent, training improved in some regions. Not everywhere, but enough to matter. Still, critics argued it wasn't enough. They said the system reacts after harm, not before. That funding is limited. That overworked caseworkers can't save everyone. And they were right. Cristian's story didn't fix the system. It exposed it. As public interest slowly faded, what remained was a quieter truth. The case wasn't about whether Cristian was evil or innocent. It was about how society handles broken environments long before they produce broken outcomes. For many people who followed the case closely, their views softened with time. Not because they forgot what happened, but because they understood more. They saw that holding two truths at once is uncomfortable but necessary. A child died, and a child was damaged. Justice had to respond to both. In the next part of this story, we'll look at where Cristian Fernandez's life stood years later, and what his case ultimately tells us about redemption, responsibility, and whether the justice system truly knows how to deal with children who commit the unimaginable. Because some stories don't end with answers. They end with questions we're still learning how to ask. As Cristian Fernandez moved closer to adulthood, the question that followed him everywhere, spoken or unspoken, was simple but heavy. Who is he now? Not who he was at 12. Not who the headlines froze in time. But the person shaped by years of supervision, therapy, and the weight of knowing his actions ended a life. The answer, like everything else in this case, was complicated. By his late teens, Cristian had spent more time inside structured systems than in a normal home. The juvenile justice system had become his environment, his classroom, and in many ways, his substitute family. He had grown up under rules, evaluations, and constant observation. Every action was recorded, every mistake noted, every improvement measured. This kind of life changes a person. Professionals who worked with Cristian described him as quiet, reserved, and thoughtful, not outgoing, not aggressive. He wasn't someone who dominated a room. If anything, he stayed on the edges. That withdrawal wasn't seen as a warning sign anymore. It was seen as caution, shaped by years of being watched. Therapy reports showed deeper self-awareness. Cristian could now talk about emotions that once overwhelmed him. He could identify frustration before it turned into anger. He could explain how his past shaped his reactions instead of denying it. These may sound like small things, but for someone with his background, they mattered. Still, progress didn't mean peace. Cristian carried guilt that therapy couldn't erase. He knew that no amount of growth could undo what happened. That knowledge stayed with him, especially as he began to understand the world more fully. As a child, consequences are abstract. As an adult, they become real. He understood that his victim never got the chance to grow. That understanding came with sadness, not defensiveness. According to evaluations, Cristian didn't minimize the harm. He didn't shift blame. He accepted responsibility in a way that felt more complete than before, not because he was told to, but because he finally grasped the weight of it. This shift mattered to those reviewing his case. As Cristian aged out of juvenile status, the system faced another decision point. What happens when a child offender becomes an adult? Does the label follow forever? Does supervision end? Or does caution override rehabilitation? These decisions are rarely clear-cut. Authorities reviewed his history again. Behavior records, therapy notes, risk assessments. They looked for signs of danger, lack of remorse, or manipulation. What they found instead was consistency. No major incidents, no violent behavior, no attempts to excuse the past. That didn't mean automatic freedom. Conditions were placed, monitoring continued, support systems were required. The goal wasn't release without oversight, it was transition. For Cristian, this transition was frightening. The outside world was unfamiliar, loud, fast, unstructured. Inside the system, everything had a rule. Outside, choices came with uncertainty. Freedom meant responsibility without constant guidance. Many former juvenile offenders struggle at this stage, not because they want to reoffend, but because they were never taught how to live independently. Cristian was no exception. He needed help with basic life skills, education planning, emotional regulation under stress, building trust with people who didn't see his file before seeing his face. And then there was the biggest challenge of all, identity. Who was Cristian allowed to be? He couldn't erase his past. He couldn't change his name in every database. Online records still existed. News articles still surfaced. Strangers still judged without context. That kind of shadow can crush a person or harden them. Professionals worked carefully to help Cristian build a sense of self that didn't revolve around the worst thing he ever did. Not denial, not forgetting, but integration, understanding that the past is part of the story, not the entire thing. This idea is central to rehabilitation. You don't tell someone they are only their crime. You also don't pretend the crime never happened. You teach them how to live responsibly with the truth. For the public, this phase of the story was largely invisible. There were no dramatic hearings, no breaking news updates, just quiet progress or setbacks behind closed doors. That silence often gets mistaken for failure or secrecy. In reality, it's how most rehabilitation actually works. Slowly, carefully, without cameras. Some critics argued that this privacy was unfair to the victim's memory. Others argued that public exposure would destroy any chance of reintegration. Both sides raised valid concerns. But the system leaned toward protection. not to protect Cristian from accountability, but to protect society from creating someone who feels permanently rejected. Research shows that people who believe they can never be accepted are more likely to give up on change. The justice system, at its best, tries to avoid that outcome. Cristian's case became a quiet test of that belief. Years later, when asked indirectly about the case, professionals involved spoke cautiously. They didn't claim success. They didn't promise redemption. They spoke about effort, about risk management, about ongoing responsibility. They emphasized that rehabilitation is not forgiveness, it's prevention, and prevention is never perfect. For those who followed the case from the beginning, this stage often felt unsatisfying. There was no clear ending, no moment where justice felt complete. That discomfort reflects reality more than fiction ever could. Some stories don't close neatly. They linger, forcing us to question our expectations. Do we want punishment or safety? Do we want revenge or prevention? Can we accept change without forgetting harm? Cristian Fernandez's life after the courtroom didn't provide easy answers, but it did provide something rare in true crime narratives, a long view, not just of a crime, but of consequence. In the next part of this story, we'll step back and examine the broader lessons of the case, what it reveals about childhood, responsibility, and the uncomfortable truth that some tragedies are shaped by many small failures, not one monstrous act. Because understanding doesn't excuse, but it can prevent the next story from ending the same way. By the time the Cristian Fernandez case reached this stage, it had stopped being just a story about one family and one tragic moment. It had become a mirror, one that forced society to look at uncomfortable truths it often prefers to avoid. Part 9 of this story isn't about court dates or verdicts. It's about what this case revealed when everything else was stripped away. The biggest lesson was simple, but deeply unsettling. Violence involving children rarely comes from nowhere. For many people, it's easier to believe that some children are simply bad. That idea creates emotional distance. It allows us to believe tragedy happens because of rare monsters, not common failures. Cristian's case challenged that belief in a way few others had. When experts laid out his life step by step, a pattern became impossible to ignore. Neglect didn't appear once. It appeared again and again. Missed warning signs, lack of supervision, emotional needs ignored for years. Adults noticed pieces of the problem, but no system ever stepped in strongly enough to change the outcome. This doesn't remove responsibility from Cristian, but it spreads responsibility wider, and that makes people uncomfortable. Because once we accept that children don't become dangerous in isolation, we also have to accept that prevention requires effort, money, and long-term attention. It requires helping families before they reach a breaking point. It requires listening when teachers, neighbors, or doctors raise concerns. And it requires believing that early intervention matters. Cristian's case showed what happens when intervention comes too late. Another hard truth was about how society understands childhood. Legally, children are treated as less responsible because their brains are still developing. Emotionally, however, we often expect them to behave like adults the moment something goes wrong. This contradiction sits at the heart of the debate around juvenile crime. When a child does something violent, public reaction tends to swing to extremes. Either the child is seen as innocent and incapable of understanding anything, or as irredeemable and beyond help. Cristian's case didn't fit either category. He understood enough to cause harm, but not enough to process stress, emotion, or consequence in a healthy way. That gray area is where the justice system struggles most. This case also forced a deeper look at punishment itself. What is punishment meant to achieve? If the goal is revenge, then rehabilitation will always feel insufficient. If the goal is safety, then the question becomes whether punishment alone actually prevents future harm. Research consistently shows that children who receive treatment, structure, and support are less likely to re-offend than those who are simply locked away and labeled. Cristian's progress inside the system supported that research, but it didn't erase fear or doubt. And fear is powerful. Fear shapes policy. Fear shapes public opinion. Fear often speaks louder than data. That's why cases like this become flashpoints. They sit at the intersection of emotion and logic, grief and prevention, justice and mercy. Another lesson came from how media coverage shaped perception. Most people who formed strong opinions about Cristian never read full court documents. They consumed headlines, clips, and summaries. Those pieces often lacked context, not because journalists were careless, but because attention spans are short and outrage spreads faster than explanation. This isn't unique to this case, but the consequences are more severe when the subject is a child. Once a label sticks, killer, monster, evil, it becomes almost impossible to remove. Even when facts complicate the narrative, the first impression remains. This has real effects. It influences how jurors think, how lawmakers respond, how communities accept or reject rehabilitated individuals. Cristian's case became an example of how storytelling can either deepen understanding or harden division. There was also a painful lesson about victims. In discussions about rehabilitation and reform, it's easy for victims to feel erased. Cristian's baby sister never had a voice. Her life was brief, and her death became a debate rather than a moment of shared mourning. This is one of the hardest balances in true crime storytelling. How do you honor the victim without turning the offender into a symbol of pure evil? How do you acknowledge harm without pretending punishment alone heals it? There are no perfect answers, but the case reminded many people that justice systems must center victims without losing sight of prevention. Honoring one life should not require destroying another if destruction does nothing to stop future harm. Cristian Fernandez's story also highlighted the limits of the justice system. Courts are not designed to raise children. Prisons are not designed to heal trauma. Judges can issue sentences, but they cannot rewrite childhoods. When cases like this reach a courtroom, it's already a sign that many opportunities were missed. This doesn't mean the system is useless. It means the system is reactive, not proactive. True prevention happens long before police reports and court hearings. It happens in stable homes, accessible mental health care, and schools with resources to act when something feels wrong. Cristian's case didn't invent these problems. It exposed them. And perhaps the most uncomfortable lesson of all was this: society often wants simple endings to complex stories. We want a moment where justice feels complete, where the scales balance, where the harm feels answered. But real life rarely provides that. Cristian's story doesn't end with redemption or damnation. It ends with responsibility. Ongoing, imperfect, and shared. Responsibility for the person he is becoming. Responsibility for remembering the child who died. Responsibility for doing better next time. Because there will be a next time. Another child, another warning sign, another family under stress. The question is whether the lessons from this case will matter when it does. In the final part of this story, we'll bring everything together, not to offer closure, but to ask the question this case leaves behind. When a child commits an unthinkable act, what does justice truly demand from all of us? Not just from courts, but from society itself. By the end of the Cristian Fernandez case, there was no clean resolution. Only a heavy silence where certainty was supposed to be. That silence is the final truth of this story. Because when a child commits an unthinkable act, justice does not arrive as a single moment. It unfolds over years through choices, supervision, growth, and the uncomfortable acceptance that some harm can never be balanced. Cristian's life did not split neatly into before and after. It became a long stretch of accountability, shaped by limits and support. He carried the knowledge that his actions ended a life. That knowledge did not fade with time. If anything, it deepened as his understanding matured. Accountability, for him, was not a sentence handed down once. It was a responsibility carried forward. And yet, The question that stayed with everyone who followed this case was not just about Cristian. It was about us. What do we want justice to do when the person responsible is also a child? Do we want punishment to express our anger? Or do we want protection that reduces the chance of future harm? These goals often collide, and when they do, the result is tension, not closure. Cristian's case showed that punishment alone cannot repair what neglect creates. It also showed that empathy without responsibility fails victims. The hard work lies in holding both truths at once. That work is slow, uncomfortable, and rarely satisfying in the way headlines demand. For the victim's family, nothing that happened afterward could restore what was lost. Their grief did not end with a verdict. It did not end with sentencing. It did not end with public debate. It continued privately in ways no courtroom could address. Any discussion of rehabilitation must sit beside that pain, not over it. For Cristian, the path forward was narrow and strict. Change did not mean freedom from consequence. It meant learning how to live with the weight of what he did while choosing not to repeat it. That is not redemption in the dramatic sense. It is responsibility in the real one. The justice system, often criticized for being cold and rigid, revealed something else here: its limits. Courts can decide guilt. Judges can decide sentences, but they cannot create safety on their own. They cannot undo childhoods shaped by chaos. They cannot substitute for early support that never came. This case exposed a truth many professionals already knew but rarely see so clearly in public view. By the time a child enters the justice system, prevention has already failed. Cristian did not grow up invisible. People noticed problems. Reports were made. Concerns were raised. What failed was follow-through, coordination, resources, the slow, steady attention that keeps families from collapsing under pressure. When society asks why something like this happened, the answer is rarely a single moment. It is a chain of missed chances. And those chances are still being missed elsewhere. There are children right now living in unstable homes, showing signs of emotional distress, acting out, withdrawing, struggling to cope. Most of them will never harm anyone, but some will reach breaking points if no one intervenes early enough. Cristian's story is not a prediction. It is a warning. It asks whether we are willing to invest in prevention instead of reacting only after tragedy. Whether we are willing to see warning signs as urgent rather than inconvenient. Whether we are willing to accept that protecting children sometimes means protecting them from becoming someone they never wanted to be. Public opinion often demands certainty. A villain, a hero, a clean ending. This case refused all of that. It asked for patience, nuance, and honesty, things that rarely go viral. True crime often focuses on the moment violence occurs. This story reminds us that the most important moments come long before and long after. Long before, when a child needs guidance, stability, and care. Long after, when society must decide whether change is possible and worth supporting. Cristian Fernandez's case does not ask for sympathy. It asks for responsibility. Collective responsibility. Responsibility to victims, whose lives deserve protection and remembrance. Responsibility to children, whose futures depend on what we do when warning signs appear. Responsibility to systems, which must do more than document failure after it happens. In the end, justice in this case was not a single ruling. It was a process, imperfect, ongoing, and deeply human. It did not promise safety forever. It aimed to reduce harm, to manage risk, and to acknowledge that people, especially children, are shaped by what surrounds them. That is not a comforting conclusion, but it is an honest one. Because if this story teaches anything, it is that preventing the next tragedy matters more than winning the last argument. And prevention begins not in courtrooms, but in homes, schools, and communities, where quiet interventions can change outcomes long before sirens ever sound. Cristian Fernandez's story ends without certainty, but it leaves behind a question that will outlast the case itself. When a child breaks in a way that harms others, will we only ask how to punish? Or will we finally ask how to protect every child before it's too late? That question is the real ending. Is